Welcome to the Athlete Insights podcast, hosted by Yash Padhye, a podcast focused on letting athletes tell their journeys in their sport. This podcast is presented by Boxed Water. Boxed water is better.
Welcome into another episode of the Athlete Insights podcast. Today, I've got my guest, Jason Setchen. He's an athlete attorney based out of Miami, Florida, who specializes in NIL, name, image, and likeness, as well as advocacy for NCAA athletes, injury representation, a whole litany of things in terms of regarding the NCAA and NCAA athletes. And so, Jason, I appreciate you taking the time and speaking with me and coming on. And I know you're busy, but appreciate you taking that time to come and speak.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to do it. I like the work that you're doing, and I appreciate the way that you're going about it. And so it's an honor to be on the podcast and share insights with you.
No, I appreciate you. So we'll jump right into it. I know your main right now, your main focus and main kind of prospect of what you do is focusing on NIL, and I talked about that NCAA and advocating for NCAA athletes on behalf of that. So could you, before we get into all of that, I'd like to ask people that I interview, what kind of sports they play. We talk about kind of their early life, career, whatever it may be before. Did you play sports growing up? Did you have interaction with sport growing up? Can you talk about that a little bit?
I did. I played 3 sports in high school: football, wrestling, and lacrosse. I went to high school in Connecticut. I was the MVP of my high school football team my senior year,
Gotcha.
a couple of years ago.
Gotcha.
I walked on at the University of Miami for a hot minute and had that experience. So that was something that I learned a lot from, and pretty active that way. Still play sports to this day. Big golfer nowadays. A little too old to play anything with too much contact or movement.
I love golf too, man. That's my thing. So play golf all the time. So I like to see that connection there. So appreciate that. And then you ended up getting your Juris Doctorate, or JD, from the University of Miami. You said you walked on at the U of M, ended up getting your JD there. And so we'll kind of talk about your expertise, your background on how you got into NIL law. Can you talk about that? How you were kind of the front runner at the beginning of all this NIL stuff and all that started, and you were getting it going from the ground up. So can you talk about kind of your experience and how you got that going with NIL and how you got involved with that?
Yeah. Well, I've worked with collegiate athletes for a long time, high school athletes as well, and pros, but the collegiate piece, obviously, for many, many years has been a lot of discussion about payment to student athletes, nil, pay for play, all kinds of different angles that have been topics of conversation as to how to compensate collegiate athletes. And so as nil started to become more of a reality before California really passed their law that got this whole thing kind of moving, and then Florida passed theirs subsequent to that and moved up the timetables, and the NCAA ultimately had to capitulate as the laws were going into effect. We were just situated in a place where we were working with so many college and professional athletes. And so we had a lot of insight from them about, what nil would look like, how it was going to work. I mean, there are other lawyers that I know very well that I have tremendous respect for: Darren Heitner, Dan Lust, some others that that are more involved with kind of the nuts and bolts of the formation of the laws, and that are more, we're a bigger part of the creation of that process. But in terms of just dealing with athletes that are confronting nil related issues, we just naturally were in a position where we were getting those calls and then facing those issues kind of as they came up when nil was, given the green light from the NCAA. So that's kind of how we got into it. I've always felt that athletes should receive more than what they were getting, which was just a scholarship and the movement board and so forth. But the way that would be effectuated, obviously, has been a topic of discussion, and still is to this day. I mean, nil is just one aspect of how athletes should or could be compensated. And so we're with that now. And even that landscape is changing. I mean, to navigate that from one day to the next is crazy because the law and the rules change constantly from state to state. So it's been interesting. But that's how we got started. We were just there, and so it just happened.
Gotcha. And for listeners that are unfamiliar with NIL, or viewers that are unfamiliar with NIL, can you just talk about kind of just the basics? You don't have to get into like the weeds of it all, but just kind of the basics of what NIL entails. Because as I was talking to you off the air a little bit, I feel like a lot of individuals are unfamiliar or not truly informed on kind of what NIL is and things of that matter. So could you talk of kind of briefly describe that a little bit?
Yeah, NIL, or name, image, and likeness, it's basically marketing opportunities for athletes to be compensated prior to the passage of law and the NCAA's renewed stance on how they addressed compensation for athletes, or how athletes could get compensated by third parties. That was all against the rules. Athletes couldn't market themselves or be paid for their services
Gotcha.
as they were related to athletics. And so when that all changed a few years back, this kind of thing was created for collegiate, and in many states, high school athletes now. Professional athletes, it's just part of their marketing, right? It's, if you're a professional athlete and you're a first round draft pick, you can enter into deals, and do enter into deals for compensation with Gatorade or Coca-Cola or your local car dealership. And that's been happening forever. But collegiate athletes were not allowed to do that. And so when that changed, that created this opportunity, which is now just known as NIL, which is obviously this compensation for name, image, and likeness. And so that's pretty much how that works. I mean, if you're a collegiate athlete and you are approached at a timely, an appropriate time, I should say, within, the structure of collegiate sports. In other words, if you are at a state, you play high school in a state that doesn't permit NIL, then you should not be discussing NIL or entering into NIL contracts, because you may lose eligibility at the high school level.
Gotcha.
Impact your ability to potentially play at the collegiate level. But for college purposes in the NCAA, if you're a student athlete and you're at a school, you might be offered an opportunity, or you may find an opportunity to do anything from a local pizza shop where you provide what's called deliverables, where you have to actually, there's no just money for nothing. You have to provide marketing services, right?
Yeah.
And they have to be typically commensurate with what you're paid.
Yeah.
Not required, but in some states it is.
Mhm.
The gist of it is essentially that student athletes are compensated for use of their name, image, and likeness, which has value and always has had value. So
Yeah.
now the student athlete can actually capitalize on that, whereas before they couldn't. So
Gotcha.
that's really what NIL kind of is. For example, if there's on a small scale, if there's a local pizza shop, and you enter into an agreement with that pizza shop, and you say, I will, after each game, say, I had a great game, and it was in large part because I felt that I was fueled by Joe's Pizza. And then you're sitting there and you're wearing the Joe's Pizza t-shirt, as long as, again, you're not wearing marks or logos from the institution, unless you have permission to do that. You can be paid for that now in college.
Gotcha.
And so there's rules obviously governing that. It's not just wide open. You have to, certain things, the timeliness of when you enter into the agreement and so forth. These are all factors. And I don't want to get too into the weeds on that, but generally speaking, student athletes can be compensated for use of their name, image, and likeness now in college at the NCAA level, which was not the case before.
And since NIL or NIL has been introduced, there's been changes, and like you mentioned, there's been different aspects to the law that have been added and things of that nature. How have you seen the landscape of NIL? How have you seen it change over the last couple of years since the laws were first introduced for athletes?
Oh, wow. Well, it's changed a lot. I mean, first of all, it changed from not being permissible to being permissible. And that obviously was the starting point. And then once it started, the restrictions were, it was a very strange time, because some states had laws regulating NIL and permitting it, but within certain, criteria. And then other states had no laws on NIL. And so when the law in Florida went into effect, the NCAA basically said, our rules against compensation for NIL, essentially, those are frozen or stayed, essentially. So, but you have to follow state law, and you have to follow your school's rules and other things that came along with that student athletes needed to comport themselves with. And then since then, the NCAA has given guidance, which is they put out guidance on what should or shouldn't happen, or what can or can't happen with respect to NIL. And that guidance is to universities, obviously, but it affects student athletes. And so, and that guidance is constantly changing, right? It gets
Mhm.
updated. And with those updates, there are certain changes in terms of what is or isn't acceptable. And so there's been this evolving process. And with due respect to the NCAA, I mean, they didn't really know how this was going to play out. And so it's been something that's been developing over time, right? It's just something that as the process has been ongoing, there are things that are identified and people have realized, okay, well, maybe this doesn't work, so we should tweak this, or maybe
Mhm.
that's not right, so we should tweak that. And so
Yeah.
that's where that guidance comes into play. And it's critical,
Mhm.
obviously, for student athletes and institutions to be aware of the guidance as it comes out from time to time to make sure that nobody's breaking any rules. And that's where the compliance officers become very critical for the institutions.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And again, I don't want to get just keep this generalized because I don't want to get too into the legal weeds like you said here. But when we have a good amount of viewers and listeners that are college athletes, high school athletes, younger athletes, and like I mentioned, kind of the information on NIL is
Right.
limited, not really understood quite fully. So what, and when you think about even college athletes or high school athletes transitioning to college, what are some considerations that these athletes need to take into account when looking at NIL deals overall, like whether from a legal perspective, whether from
Right.
overall
Well,
perspective?
for starters, the rules, the rules, the rules. You
Yeah,
need to know what those are.
yeah,
And for collegiate athletes,
yeah,
they go to institutions that have NCAA compliance officers, and those people go to work every day,
yeah.
and it's their job to stay up to speed on, everything that's happening in the world of NIL and the NCAA rules and bylaws and recent cases that have been decided and so forth. And so it's important for student athletes to take advantage of that. A lot of student athletes are kind of out there and they're doing their thing with the nil stuff. And I feel like they don't take advantage of the resources that exist for them in the compliance department of their own institution. The
Gotcha.
NCAA also has a hotline for eligibility, but you can ask questions there. There's plenty
Mhm.
of literature that's given annually or even probably semi-annually by the
Yeah,
NCAA that helps student athletes get a general understanding.
yeah.
Institutions are doing a really good job, most of them, in educating their student athletes on what the do's and don'ts are.
Mhm.
So it's just really important that if you're going to be a student athlete that is going to engage in nil activity,
Yeah.
first thing you have to do is understand the rules and understand what is permissible and what isn't,
Mhm.
and really get a good understanding of that. And then once that has been accomplished, then you can kind of start your journey on that path. I think that's the most important thing that a student athlete can do for themselves, their families, et cetera, because
Gotcha.
eligibility is something that is critical, obviously, to a
Mhm.
student athlete being able to compete. And
Yeah.
you don't want to do anything that could potentially jeopardize that.
No, for sure.
So that would be the key element to that. The other thing I would suggest is if you're entering into contracts of any kind, doesn't matter
Mhm.
what it is, that you should consider getting an attorney involved to
Yeah.
make sure that if you're going to execute an agreement that's going to bind you to something, you want to make sure that that contract is fair and that all the things that need to be in there for your sake to protect
Mhm.
you as an athlete are in there. But
Yeah.
more importantly, you want to make sure that that contract isn't obligating you to do something that you can't do
Yeah.
under the rules,
Mhm.
right? Because we've
Yeah.
seen those. Um, and that it's not somehow impermissible just on its face, where
Mhm.
just the contract in itself is creating an NCAA nil violation,
Mhm.
right? So these are the sorts of things that you should be doing if you're a student athlete and you're engaging in these types of agreements and these types of arrangements.
And
Lastly, you need to make sure that
mhm.
the deliverables portion of your agreement that you fulfill those,
Yeah.
because this is not money for nothing.
Mhm.
These are marketing agreements. And so if you're agreeing to post a certain amount of posts, or you're agreeing to engage in some type of activity,
Mhm.
uh, attend an autograph signing or whatever it is that your deliverables are,
Yeah.
that's super permissible, then you should fulfill them.
No, I agree. I agree. And, and that's, I mean, I think that's where the misinformation communication also derives from is how the contract works or how that stuff works. And a lot of like the students that I talk to or deal with don't fully understand that, but it's like I said, it's good that we have you here on the podcast to kind of explain that and go through that process. So I appreciate that as well. And the other thing too is when you think about the benefits, you mentioned how they're really marketing agreements that you're signing to.
Right.
And you look at the benefits a lot of times, and from what I've seen, I can't speak for you, but from what I've seen is the benefits are monetary benefits, but what other benefits do you see from student athletes embracing NIL? And those opportunities for those parties.
Well, it really, every case is different, right? And
Mhm.
every opportunity is different because the
Yeah.
rules are different from state to
Mhm.
state. And
Yeah.
so you want to make sure, first and foremost, you're compliant with state law, but you
Mhm.
also want to stay compliant with NCAA rules at
Yeah.
all times.
Gotcha.
And so different deals are structured different ways, right?
Yeah.
It's like saying to five athletes in the NFL, what deals do you have for marketing, and what are you receiving in
Mhm.
exchange for doing them, right? Sometimes it's monetary, other times it might be an exchange. For
Yeah.
example, if an athlete is going to participate in a nil arrangement, it may include some exchange, right?
Yeah.
If they're going to, maybe they get a credit in a restaurant instead
Mhm.
of money, right, in
Yeah.
exchange for their use of nil, and whatever it is that they may engage in.
Mhm.
Obviously, it needs to be run through compliance at all times, whatever that is,
Mhm.
especially if it's not a traditional arrangement,
Gotcha.
because that's where people can get themselves into trouble. But it's hard to answer that question. It really
Uh-huh.
is.
Yeah.
Again, you just want to make sure when entering into any contract, especially if you're a young student athlete with a
Yeah.
lot of potential for the next level,
Mhm.
you don't want to engage in something or enter into an agreement that might limit you when you move past college,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So exclusivity
Yeah.
or some type of a non-compete that may be worked into a deal, or the duration of the deal.
Yeah.
Those are all things that people need to consider when they're, student athletes are entering into these types of arrangements.
Yeah. And no, I mean, you're right. Considering that and considering the different arrangements that can be included in nil. The only reason I brought that up is because I like from my experience talking to individuals, um, a lot of them when they think about nil, they think about money and free
Right.
stuff. And that's
Yeah.
kind of what their goal is. That's what they're thinking about. And that's why I'm like, there's other benefits that can be derived from nil, not just money and free stuff. Like
Right, exactly. No, that's true. Nil is not about free anything, right?
yeah,
Nil is about compensating student athletes for the use of their name, image, and
name,
likeness.
image, and
Right.
likeness.
So there are deliverables that are
Yeah.
required as part of any
Mhm.
deal. It's not just I'm going to pay you X and then, have a nice day.
Mhm.
It's a job. It's
Yeah.
something in addition to
Yeah.
all the other stuff that student athletes have to consider
Yeah.
when they wake up in the morning, is that now it's kind of me Inc., right? Like
Yeah.
I'm business. And
Yeah.
so the use of my name, image, and likeness is critical. I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
If there's more incentive for a student athlete to maintain their grades, stay out of trouble, have a good
Mhm.
image, because
Yeah.
by doing that, you're benefiting your name and image and likeness and the value of your name, image, and likeness. And it makes it more valuable if you're a good player and you have a great reputation and
Mhm.
you're a good person, you're
Yeah.
more marketable, right?
Yeah.
So now you really need to be thinking about those things all the time if you're
Mhm.
a student athlete, because you don't want to do anything that's going to damage the product, right? And that's
Yep.
going to damage your ability to market yourself.
Yeah.
So if you become ineligible for academics, for example, or you get into trouble, or someone else gets into trouble, but you're somehow involved with that or involved with it, even if you don't get in trouble
That's
yourself, it's
mhm.
it's a bad look. It may turn off potential marketers or marketing
Mhm.
opportunities.
Yeah.
So
Uh-huh.
these are new considerations that student athletes have to deal with. They have to juggle more now than they did before because, like I said, it's not money for nothing.
Yeah.
So on top of practice and school and everything else you have to maintain, you've got to now fulfill the deliverables and make sure you're living up to your end of the bargain.
Gotcha, gotcha. And what trends now, we've kind of talked about kind of what the NIL is, kind of how it's going. You've given some examples of kind of how athletes can navigate that process. But as we move into the future, NIL, at least from my belief, is it's not just a fad. It's not just here for a while. It's here for the long term, here for the long run. And so, how do you see the future of NIL? Just kind of based on what you've seen so far over the last couple years, how do you see what trends do you foresee in the future with NIL?
Well,
And
it's really the last couple of weeks. That's the thing about NIL that's been so wacky, is that it's been changing so rapidly. I mean,
yeah,
the NCAA went from being against NIL to kind of
yeah,
accepting it, to now the president of the NCAA has come out and spoken about the idea of potentially creating another division
yeah,
where student athletes might even be paid by institutions. So that's been thrown around, and
mhm,
that's a completely new concept for the NCAA.
yeah,
So when you talk about where is it going or what might come
yeah,
of NIL,
yeah,
it's really hard to say,
yeah,
because it's not on a progression like a normal thing that's just kind of like clicking along over a period of time. It's very new, and
yeah,
it's changed very rapidly. And
yeah,
so it's so hard to say, oh, well, here's where we'll be in a year from now or 5 years from now. It's hard to even say where we might be 3 months from now with
gotcha.
NIL.
Yeah,
Honestly, I mean, that's the
yeah,
crazy thing about it. That's
mhm,
why it's so important for student athletes to continue to stay in touch with compliance, not just on one deal or when they get to school,
yeah,
to stay on top of it with them and continue to communicate as they enter into other opportunities, if other opportunities are presented to them, because this
mhm,
is moving so rapidly. You just don't want to step into something that might impact your eligibility and put you in a bad position by inadvertently.
no, I agree. I agree. And like you said, it's changing so rapidly, like you said, within the last couple of weeks, and how it's going to grow. I mean, it kind of reminds me of AI, and like how AI over the last couple of years has changed so much. You don't know how AI is going to change. Very similar with NIL in that process. And so but no, I appreciate you coming on, kind of talking about this process and giving your insight, giving your advice on how athletes can go about navigating. And I think, once this episode airs and gets out, I think it's going to help a lot of athletes, high school athletes or college athletes starting out, really understand kind of how to navigate their process. But is there any other piece of advice, or any piece of advice that you would give outside of what you've given so far to potential college athletes or current college athletes that are going through the process?
Yeah. First and foremost, as I said before, the key is understanding NIL and having somebody explain it regularly to make sure that you're on top of the rules. That
Mhm.
I've said a couple times. I can't say that enough,
Yeah.
because most kids just think NIL is about getting paid
Yeah.
and doing a couple of Instagram posts.
Mhm.
And it's not only about that. There
Yeah.
are contractual considerations. We've had countless cases of kids coming in here with wacky contracts that they've signed, some of which aren't even enforceable anyway, because they're so ridiculous. But they're just, it's kind of like, who read this? Why
Mhm.
did you sign this? Did you understand what you were doing before you did this?
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of thing that kids should try to avoid,
Yeah.
is get help from somebody that knows what they're talking about, that
Mhm.
give you proper advice before you sign something and bind yourself to something.
Yeah.
Know the rules, speak to compliance, stay on top of the NCAA literature that comes out. You're the business.
Yeah.
It's about you. So take care of your business by knowing the rules.
Mhm.
Spend the time to understand the rules and to stay on top of them and to communicate with all the right people within the institution, so that you stay on top of things and don't misstep. The other thing, which is really the bigger thing, is
Yeah.
if you're in high school and you're headed to college, we get calls all the time from kids' parents that are starting the journey towards getting a scholarship,
Yeah.
and they want to talk about NIL. And then we ask them, well, what about just becoming a qualifier and the core credits and all of that stuff? Are
Yeah.
the grades right? What are
Mhm.
you doing about all these other things to become eligible? And
Yeah.
they don't know much about it,
Mhm.
right? It's all tied together.
Yeah.
You
Eh,
can't get NIL in college to play a college sport if you're ineligible to play the college sport.
yeah.
So you really need to pay attention to your sport
Mhm.
and practicing and being good at what you're doing and doing it right, but also maintaining your grades and making sure you're eligible
Yeah.
for all those other reasons. And then apply that same approach to how you address NIL, right? Don't
Mhm.
just talk to somebody over a phone and say, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then somebody sends you an email and it's like DocuSign. You don't even read it. You just push the buttons.
Yeah.
No, print it out, read it, make sure you understand it. If there's something you don't understand,
Yeah.
get someone to help you with it, then run it by a compliance officer, make sure, to whatever extent the school's willing to help,
Yeah.
make sure you're following through on that stuff. So those are the key tips to give. It's just not give me some money and let's
I
move
get some
on.
free stuff and move on. That's not how it works. And that's what I wanted, you to talk about. That's what I love having you here, is because you really explain that process. Hey, it's not free. Nothing's free. I mean, I was told as a kid, nothing's free. You
Yeah,
always have to
well, that's
work
true.
for what you got. Nothing, you're not going to get free stuff handed to you. And so so that's, I mean, it's great that you're explaining that. And I love how you talk about, like, a lot of kids, I think, don't think about that in terms of grades, being ineligible, doing all, like, doing all the things. And like you said, it allows kids, I think nil allows kids to be more responsible and create that better image of themselves, rather than slacking off on school or
Yeah.
skipping classes and whatever it may be. And so that, I think, will helps students through that process. And the other thing is, it's like you said, read through everything, get an attorney like yourself who is very knowledgeable, is at the forefront of NIL and nil, and go through that before you sign something. Because I mean, I've done that a couple times where I've signed. I mean, I do the Apple terms and agreement. I don't even read that stuff. I just go down the list and hit accept. And now, like, now I'm like, like I told you, I teach sport law as well as part of my doctorate. And so, going through that process, it's like now you're like going through and like actually going through and reading the contracts and understanding what I'm actually accepting or declining,
Right.
is key. And so I think, and doing that at the NIL level as well is key for athletes, especially 17, 18, 19-year-old kids that are coming in, that might not really understand some of this stuff. So I
Right,
appreciate.
exactly. Well, you make the Apple example, and there's 100 of those types of examples. We've all
Yeah.
been there.
Yeah.
But this is different because it's your
Yeah.
eligibility. And if
Yeah.
you lose your eligibility,
Yeah.
that's not a good situation. That's
Yeah.
something that obviously can affect your marketing, but also your
Mhm.
education opportunities. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of things. Your scholarship is tied to you being in school,
Gotcha. Yeah.
being able to compete and so
Yeah.
forth, if it's an athletic scholarship. So
Yeah.
it's important that if you just sign the box in the Apple thing, you might tie yourself to a year's worth of paying $99 a year for something you
Yeah.
wish you could cancel
Yeah.
and you can't. But
Yeah.
here, if you sign a contract, for example, that says, we're gonna pay you $100 for every sack, and we're gonna pay you, if you make a bowl game, we're gonna pay you another $1,000.
Yeah.
Those are pay for
That's
play
different.
provisions. They're violative of the NCAA rules.
Yeah.
And if you do enter into that agreement, that's not the end of the earth. It's bad. But
Yeah.
if you actually follow through on it, and then that happens, and you've
Then,
been compensated for those things, you
yeah.
might lose eligibility. You may not
Yeah.
be able to compete. So,
Which
like,
will cause
just don't.
issues moving forward. Yeah.
Exactly. So if
Yeah.
somebody signs off on that, that would be a mistake, and it's something that anyone that knows about nil and how it works would read that and say, "Oh, you can't do this.
Yeah.
This doesn't work."
Yeah.
Right? It's a
Well,
violation of NCAA rules.
and that's what I like with, talking with you, and like how, I mean, I know there's attorneys in Colorado, that we can reach out to. I know NIL collectives talk about that too. And so having somebody like you talking about that, that's very knowledgeable, that has, like, again, like I said, is at the forefront of NIL and really understands it, and having athletes, or giving athletes that resource to reach out to an attorney or talk to an attorney, that's key, like you said. Because again, to me, when I think about it, I'm like, they're 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. Like when I was
Yeah,
17, 18, 19, 20 years old, I didn't know any better. I didn't know
of
a lot
course.
about that stuff. And so reaching out to an attorney and actually getting an understanding of what you're signing to, what you're agreeing to, is key on that. So I appreciate you kind of, uh, talking about that and talking about that process. So no, but yeah, so I appreciate you coming on, Jason.
My
Thank you so
pleasure.
much again for providing your insight. And I think this is, I mean, once this gets out, I think it's going to help a lot of high school athletes, not only in the state of Colorado, but around the United States, because I do have viewers all over the US. So hopefully will help a lot of high school athletes, college athletes who are in that process now, kind of get a real insight on how it entails. So appreciate you for
My
coming.
pleasure.
And I'll have your social media handles on
Okay.
YouTube video, and then I'll have them in the description. I'll have them in the Spotify description as well. So if any of
Sure.
my viewers, listeners, please, if you are in that process, reach out to Jason. I'll have his social media and you can reach out to them on that aspect as well. So
one thing I do want to mention, we were
Mhm.
talking mostly about NCAA and their rules. You know,
Yeah.
every high school sports association, for example, in Florida, we have the FHSAA. Right now in Florida, it's
Mhm.
not permissible to earn any money with respect to name, image, and likeness. Other states do permit it.
Yeah.
And in those states, those high school associations have their own rules and regulations.
Uh-huh.
And so you have to follow those
Yeah.
very carefully. Because again, just like what I said about the NCAA, the same is true for high school.
Yeah.
There are rules and there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. And you
Yeah.
need to know what those are before
Mhm.
you enter into any agreement with anybody or
Yeah.
take in money to do any deliverables, because you don't want to jeopardize your high school eligibility. And it's the same
Key.
things apply to high school as they do in college in that regard.
Yeah, and if you cause any issues with your high school eligibility, it could lead your ability to or impact your ability to get NIL or eligibility at the college level, and that leads to broader issues moving forward. So no, I appreciate you saying that. So
Yeah. No,
yeah,
that's
I
important.
mean,
That's a
and
distinction.
it's important, like you said, to know every state has different rules and different regulations. Like you said, Florida doesn't permit high school athletes to get NIL. I believe Colorado doesn't either, but there's certain states that do, and you got to really understand and get into understanding those rules and regulations before you
And they're
do.
changing. The
Yeah.
FHSA just met recently to talk about the possibility of allowing athletes in Florida potentially to be able to capitalize on name, image, and likeness.
Yeah.
But so it's, again, it comes to that whole thing of staying on top of things all the time and understanding what's happening,
Yeah.
because things are moving very quickly. And
Mhm.
so just want to make sure that whatever you're doing meets all of the state laws
Yep.
and is compliant with either your high school association rules or your, NCAA rules.
No, I appreciate you talking through that and really giving us insight with that. But no, I appreciate you, Jason. Thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.